There's a Russian children's story called Mysh и Karandash, or The Mouse and the Pencil, and it goes like this. It begins with a mouse that notices a neighboring pencil and decides to just go ahead and help himself and take it. The pencil says, let me go, and the mouse says, no, I'm not going to let you go, I'm going to gnaw you to little bits. And then the pencil says, well, look, if you're going to gnaw me to bits anyway, could you grant me one last request? Would you let me draw a picture? And the mouse says, okay. The short version of the story is that the pencil begins to draw, and the mouse thinks, ooh, that looks like a piece of cheese. Ooh, now that looks like an apple and some sausages. And then the pencil draws a picture of a cat, and the mouse goes, ah, it's a cat. And then the mouse runs away. So the mouse never ran away from a real cat, it ran away from a picture of a cat. And the art of Russian propaganda is drawing pictures that frighten the West. So what kind of picture is Russian propaganda drawing? Well, we have shirtless Putin on horseback, we have shirtless Putin fishing, we have shirtless Putin stalking through the grass with a rifle. We have tanks, we have troops, we have good-looking troops, and we certainly have better recruiting ads than you do. But is the Russian war machine truly invincible? Let's look at some recent history. In the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Navy lost every single ship involved in the Battle of Port Arthur. They lost to the Japanese fleet that was ably led by Admiral Togo. The Japanese themselves had made the stunning transition from medieval to modern in just 50 years and were able to take on the Russian military and defeat it decisively. In World War I, the Allies had placed a lot of hope in what was called the Russian steamroller. It was assumed that once mobilized, the massive Russian army would just crush the Germans on their eastern front. The result was that General Rennenkampf and General Samsonov, leading the Russian armies, were defeated severely at the Battle of Tannenberg by Generals Ludendorff and Hindenburg. What went wrong? Among other things, poor training, poor leadership, rivalry between the two Russian generals, poor logistics, poor communication, corruption in the military, and alcoholism. In other words, the exact same things that are hindering the Russian war effort in Ukraine today. Now, to be fair, the Russians do produce some really good generals from time to time who get results. General Kutuzov managed to push Napoleon out of Russia and back into France, and General Zhukov managed to rid the Soviet Union of the Nazi presence in World War II. But today, Putin does not prefer competent generals. He prefers generals who tell him what he wants to hear. And this has led to significant problems with the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. Now here's a much more accurate depiction, or picture if you will, of how things are going on in Ukraine 1 year later. Now, recall that 1 year ago everybody assumed that Ukraine would fall very quickly. One Russian propagandist gloated that in 1 week Ukraine will cease to exist, which is an interesting insight into how the Putin supporters view the people that they hope to conquer. Now, Ukraine did not fall, and when the fall of Kiev looked imminent, remember that Kiev was rescued by determined Ukrainians armed with little more than shoulder-fired rocket launchers, which they had to look up on YouTube to learn how to operate. But they beat back the Russian military, and since then things have changed significantly. Not only are the Russians suffering staggering losses on the battlefield, but young Russian men of age to be mobilized are leaving the country. Perhaps over 100,000 have already left. That means Russia's best and brightest are leaving the country, which is why for a while the Wagner Group had to recruit from Russian prisoners. Because of the unexpected situation in Ukraine and the unexpected unity of the NATO alliance, Putin has had to reconsider, and he's had to draw a new picture. The picture that he is drawing, and one that he's drawn a few times already in the last year, is the mushroom cloud, the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. But would he really be likely to do that? Would Putin set off, say, a small tactical nuclear weapon somewhere in Ukraine? Well, what's the advantage to exposing your own soldiers to deadly radiation, making the ground uninhabitable and unconquerable because of that same radiation, and the possibility of a swift, violent, and catastrophic, maybe even conventional response from NATO is something he has to consider. If Putin were to order the launching of the large-scale missiles, the submarine-launched ICBMs and so forth, he would be risking issuing an order that his own military would refuse to obey. And Putin, at this point, cannot afford to lose face like that. Besides, he has already threatened the use of nuclear weapons. We have called his bluff, and he backed down. With reality being so unfavorable to Russia right now, why is Russian propaganda getting so much traction? Well, remember, the Force can have a strong influence on the weak-minded. And unfortunately, so can Russian propaganda. I grew up in the last 30 years of the Cold War era, and I remember how the political left generally accepted Soviet propaganda at face value. I also remember the hand-wringing and the bedwetting over Ronald Reagan's confrontational stance with the Soviet Union, how they were convinced that statements like calling out the Soviet Union as an evil empire, stating our foreign policy as we win, they lose, calling on Chairman Gorbachev to tear down this wall, were simply over the top, and that Reagan was going to bring us into a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. When in fact, what did happen is Reagan, by his determination and by his intelligence, brought about the end of the Soviet Union. And today, I'm seeing the political right believing the same lies from the same sources, even to the point of believing that we should engage in a cowardly and cringing foreign policy of appeasement by granting Russia everything that they wish. President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the city of Bucha shortly after it was liberated, and there he became an eyewitness to the torture and the murder that had been visited upon Ukrainian civilians by the Russian army. Yes, every army in the world has rogue soldiers that have committed war crimes, including ours, but in the Russian army, these are not exceptions. This is the standard operating procedure of the Russian military, and every wrecked city and village in Ukraine is evidence of just that. As long as there is a Vladimir Putin, as long as there is a Russian military, this is how it will be used. Ukraine has shown us that Russia can be beaten. In fact, it is the sacrifice of Ukrainian soldiers that have prevented this conflict from expanding into a wider European war that would involve us directly. It is time to stop believing Russian propaganda. It is time to unite behind Ukraine and give them what they need to liberate their country and to secure their borders.